All right, well here is the skeletal system tutorial. I thought I would start with the review because there's really only 3 bullet points of what you need to know for the skeletal system. I was afraid if I started with the page that had the vocabulary on it, you would get completely overwhelmed because it seems like there's a lot of vocabulary because you have to know all the bones. Certainly not all the bones in the body. There's 206 bones in your body, but you need to know those 22 bones, if you count phalanges twice for your fingers and toes, that we've been reviewing in class. So, like I said, you need to know the bones from the diagram. And I am going to post a blank one on Google Classroom that you can practice with, and I'll make copies that you can do, that you can use tomorrow in class. You also need to know the functions of the skeletal system, and that's on a foldable in your interactive notebook. So we will talk about that in a minute. And then the 4 parts of the bone and their function. And that's it. So even though it's a lot of vocabulary, it's those 3 bullet points, is knowing the bones, knowing the function of the skeletal system, and knowing the 4 parts of the bone. Okay, so now let's take a look at the vocabulary. The vocabulary is broken up into different sections, although like I said, it looks kind of overwhelming. But the 4 parts of the bone are right here. The periosteum is the outer covering or the membrane. Then the compact bone, which is the hardest and most dense part of the bone. The spongy bone, and then the bone marrow. And then you have red marrow and yellow marrow. Red makes blood cells and yellow stores fat. And then you have 4 different types of joints. You're going to need to know what those joints are and where to find them in the body. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Then you have 2 types of joints, movable and immovable. So just like the skeletal system is broken up into voluntary and involuntary muscles, the joints in our skeletal system are divided into 2 categories, movable and immovable. So obviously movable can move and immovable can't. An example of immovable joint would be where your ribs meet your sternum. So that is a joint where 2 bones come together, but they can't move. And then the bones in your cranium, you have 2 bones that come together there, but they can't move either. And then you have our bones. So you are going to need to know these from the diagram. But when we play Mother Bird Says in class, it seems like most of you have a pretty good handle on it. So we will practice more of that tomorrow. And then finally we've got cartilage. And cartilage is the softer part of your body, like your nose and your ear is made of cartilage, and a lot of baby skeletons made of cartilage. So I'm going to move on to the specific concepts, and we're going to start with the parts of the bone. Okay, so parts of the bone. I thought I would just go right from the foldable that's in your interactive notebook to use as the example. Now, these are actually 3 parts of the bone, okay, so don't be confused. This is 1 part, 2 parts, and then these 2 are together as the 3rd part. And then you have the periosteum, which is the outer covering, periosteum. Like I said, I don't have my stylus home tonight, so I'm using my finger. That's not too bad. So if you're looking at a bone, and the periosteum would be this outer membrane, and blood vessels go through it that are attached to the bone. So the periosteum is a membrane, and it's very thin. So if I ask you what is the hardest part of the bone, you are not going to tell me it's the periosteum. If I ask you what is the hardest part of the bone, you're going to tell me that it is compact bone. First of all, it just sounds stronger than spongy. You got to admit that. And we all know that marrow is a liquid in the center of the bone, so it can't be that. So its compact bone is the hardest part. So I'll do that in red. Let's see. And then, hang on. So then the compact bone would be this layer here, just on the outside, okay? So fortunately for some of us that aren't very coordinated, there's compact bone on the outside to protect all the gushy stuff on the inside. And now then this would be the spongy bone, and it's kind of looks like a sponge. It's got holes in it, okay? It is also strong, but it has holes in it so that your bones will be a little bit lighter, because if we had dense compact bone throughout all of our skeleton, it would be really hard to move because our bones would be really heavy. And then we have marrow. So let me see if I can find a good marrow color. Okay, so let's go with yellow for marrow. And that would be marrow, okay? So your red marrow makes blood cells, and your yellow marrow stores fat for energy. Remember, fat is for energy. And then, let's see, so we've got this compact bone, which is here, and then spongy bone, which is here. So 4 parts of the bone: spongy bone, compact bone, bone marrow, and then finally the periosteum, which is this layer of very thin membrane on the outside. Okay, now we've got the 5 functions of the skeleton, or the 5 functions of your skeletal system, which are your bones. The first function is the formation of blood cells, and you know that that happens in the marrow. The second function is movement. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, where the skeleton attaches to the muscles. Protection, especially for those internal organs. So be prepared to answer a question like, name a bone that protects internal organs, like your rib cage protects your lungs and your stomach, your sternum and upper rib cage protect your heart, your vertebrae protect your spine, but you all seem to have gotten that pretty well when we were going over it in class. Okay, reservoir. Now remember, a reservoir means to store something, storage, okay? So a reservoir, remember your bones store calcium and phosphorus for when your body needs them at a later time. And again, we know that the marrow stores fat for energy. And then obviously support. So without support, we would look like that boneless chicken ranch comic that I found that I thought was hysterical. We would all just be laying around as a pile of bones and skin. All right, you knew that I would post this on here, of course. I just think this comic is hysterical. But in case you missed it somehow, this is what would happen if chickens didn't have bones. Boneless chicken ranch, you get it, like you buy boneless chicken. Anyway, this is what we would look like if we didn't have bones. Okay, I found a good picture of cartilage. Remember we talked about as cartilage was a softer tissue in your body that was similar to bone, but like I said, it was much softer. You find it in your nose and your ears, and especially on the ends of bone. So you can see here, this is that cartilage that protects the ends of the bone. So that is the definition of cartilage. Cartilage. And so if you were to just draw a bone like this, then it would be this up here would be like this little like coating almost, but much thicker than the periosteum on the top of the bone. All right, and now we're on to the joints. There are 4 types of joints. and they are pivot, ball and socket, hinge, and gliding. So you can see, and you can kind of see in the picture that accompanies the joints. Pivot joints means it moves back and forth. So you pivot your head, you just turn your head back and forth. Another pivot joint would be in your wrist, where you, not really your wrist, but your lower arm, where you can turn your arm almost like you're turning a doorknob. That would be a pivot joint. And any of you basketball players know that when you pivot, you have to plant one foot and only move the other foot because you're kind of going around in circles. So that's what a pivot joint is. So you're going to need to know the joint, what the joint is, and where to find it in the body. Another kind of, so that's a pivot joint. Another kind of joint is the ball and socket joint, and that is in your shoulder and in your hip. And that is literally a ball that goes into a socket that's held together by ligaments. And we saw that on the top of the chicken wing. A hinge joint is like a door that opens and closes. That's the next kind, and you'll find that in your elbows and your knees. It only opens in one direction. If it's opening in the other direction, then you need to go to the doctor because that's not good. The fourth kind of joint is a gliding joint, and that's where those bones glide across the top of each other. And that would be in your ankles and in your wrists. So 4 types of joints. Pivot, where it turns back and forth. Ball and socket, that is your greatest range of motion, is in your ball and socket joint. And that is in your shoulder and your hip. Hinge joint, just like a door. This looks just like a door hinge where it opens and closes. That's in your elbow and your knee. And then a gliding joint where those bones just move across the top of each other, and that would be in your wrist and your ankles. Okay, finally, we've got the bones. And I am going to include some, I already have actually included some links on Google Classroom to some ways to practice memorizing the bones. But the best way to memorize the bones is to use those flashcards that I had you make and label yourselves, label your siblings, label your parents, make the skeleton out of those cards. Repetition, repetition, repetition. That is the best way to learn it. And we'll be going over it tomorrow and playing some games, but there's really no other way. So practice, practice, practice. And hopefully we'll play a lot of Mother Bird Says tomorrow, and maybe I'll even have some prizes. So the best way to do it is to just practice. I am going to have a tutorial after school tomorrow, so you are welcome to join me for that. And your best bet in studying for this test is to break it up into 3 separate units. So study the muscular system, then study the skeletal system, then study the nervous system. Don't try to do it all at the same time because there's a lot of vocabulary with this particular test because of the skeletal system. So don't get overwhelmed by it. And when in doubt, do your best.